And welcome back to Face the Nation. We want to continue our conversation with Congressman Adam Schiff. Congressman, you are a former prosecutor. What did you make of the president's comments in the New York Times that he thought it would be a violation if the special counsel went looking into his finances?
Well, I had a couple impressions. First, the president is clearly worried that Bob Mueller is going to be looking into allegations, for example, that the Russians may have laundered money through the Trump organization. That is really something, in my opinion, he needs to look at, because what concerns me the most is anything that could be held over the president's head that could influence U.S. policy. That would be among the most powerful form of compromise. So I think it is something he needs to look at. It's something plainly the president is very concerned about, but clearly within the scope of Mueller's investigation. And I'll say this, in light of all the talk about Jeff Sessions lately, it does concern me that the president should bring this up now if it's an indication that he wants to somehow push Sessions out and get in a new attorney general who would then take Rod Rosenstein's place as supervising the Mueller investigation. If this is part of a longer-term stratagem to define or confine the scope of the Mueller investigation, that would be very concerning. Rod
Rosenstein being the Deputy Attorney General who oversees the investigation now. Speaking of Senator Sessions, there's been this report in the Washington Post, as Senator Collins said, it's an anonymous source about perhaps an intercept that was picked up, so caution is in order. But even if the Post is right, Senator Sessions said he didn't talk about the campaign. The allegation is he talked about Russia and Russia policy with the ambassador. Isn't that a perfectly fine thing for a senator to do, to talk to the Russian ambassador about policy and what a possible President Trump policy towards Russia might be?
Well, it wouldn't be objectionable if he had been straightforward and honest about it with the Senate. But of course, he initially denied having any such meetings, and then he acknowledged such meetings, but said that they weren't about the campaign. And I think that strains credulity, whether or not that Washington Post story is accurate. I think I share the assessment John McCain expressed earlier of deep skepticism that he was being sought out in his role as a member of the Armed Services Committee, rather than his very prominent role on the Trump campaign. So, this is a part of a pattern. If the members of the Trump team were honest and transparent and forthcoming about these things, it would raise a lot less questions. But of course, that has not been the case, and now we see evidence in those emails about the Don Jr. meeting, why they have been concealing these things. So quite separate and apart from the Washington Post story, I think there's a lot about what the Attorney General has said that just doesn't hold much water, and that we really do need to get to the bottom of.
What's your response to the administration officials who say, this is an investigation where the special counsel can kind of go wherever he wants, and it can go all over the place? What are the checks on him?
Well, the checks on him are what is set out in his charter, which is he has an investigation that he's been authorized to do into Russian connections with the Trump campaign and anything that arises from that. So that's his charter, and I think all of what we're talking about is well within the scope of that. If he were to go off on a detour that had nothing to do with that, it would be an issue. But Bob Mueller knows exactly what he's doing, which is why members of both parties have such confidence in him. I don't think he's going to use this to explore things that are completely unrelated. But he does have the power to look into these financial issues that the president seems so concerned about because the Russians use their financial leverage over people to influence policy. That's what they do in Europe. It's part of why they like business leaders as heads of state, because they can enter into business transactions before or during that then can be used as a way of influencing their decision making, and of course that would be detrimental to U.S. interests.
You're speaking about this as a kind of theoretical matter. Has what you've looked at in the course of your work suggested that pattern has more than just the possibility, but that there's some evidence behind it?
Well, I don't want to comment on the evidence, but I do think we need to look at each and every instrumentality the Russians have used elsewhere, some that we know that were used here, and determine, are there other ways that the Russians have sought to exercise influence? Because at the end of the day, we need to make sure that our president is operating not in his personal best interests, and not because he's worried about what the Russians might have, but because what he is doing is in America's best interest. The fact that we have questions about this is in itself harmful, but we need to get answers to them so that the country can be confident that the chief executive's doing the nation's business first and foremost.
All right, Congressman Schiff, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, John.
And joining us now is Senator John Barrasso, who is a member of the Republican leadership team, and there have been a lot of health care meetings in your office, Senator. The president wants repeal and replace. What is going to get voted on next Tuesday?
Well, it's a motion to proceed to the bill that passed the House. That then comes to the Senate, and then we can vote, once we get on that bill, to amend it in various ways. And lots of members have different ideas on how it should be best amended to replace what is really a failing Obama health care plan.
When you talk about the motion to proceed, that means basically to begin conversation. There have been some senators who've expressed that they will vote against that, not even begin talking. Where does that stand right now?
We're continuing to work with all of the members. We're getting much closer to that. We are going to vote this week, and I think until the vote is actually on the floor of the Senate, some people may not tell you what they're actually going to do, but we all got elected to legislate, and that's why we're here. You know, people have campaigned, Republicans over the years, to repeal and replace Obamacare. This is our chance, and I think it's hard to believe somebody who has run in one election could go home and face the voters again and say, I'm not even willing to debate it on the floor.
You mentioned that repeal and replace will be on, but there's been talk of having just a straight-up vote on repeal. In fact, Senator McConnell said the 2015 bill, straight repeal, would be voted on. So that vote will still happen. It'll just be as an amendment?
Yeah, people can offer that as an amendment to what's passed the House. I have a number of things that I think really improve on the House bill. President Trump has said it should be more generous. We have done that. The bill that I've been working on in the Senate actually lowers insurance premiums, makes insurance more affordable by 30%. It puts Medicaid on a much more sustainable path. And you know, Medicaid was designed initially for low-income women and children and the disabled, but it's changed significantly under Obamacare.
Senator Corker talked about the efforts this week to try to get everybody back on the beam here, and he said, I fear that it's beginning to lack coherency. It's beginning to feel like a bazaar, much like how Obamacare was put together, where disparate things are added and put in. What's your response to that?
I was in the Wyoming legislature for 5 years. That's what legislation is all about. You get a bill on the floor of the House or the Senate, we get a bill, and then you start adding amendments. You bring your best ideas forward, and then people vote up or down. So as the amendments get added to the bill, in the end, there's a final vote. Do you approve or not approve of the whole amended package? And that's what we're trying to do. And that's why I think people run for office to take tough votes, to legislate, and to live with the consequences.
There is obviously another structural way to do this, which is the bipartisan route. You heard Senator Collins make that claim. She said we should go back to a bipartisan approach. This one has not been. Senator Murkowski also suggested that, Senator Graham, Senator McCain, and polls show people desperate for a bipartisan approach. Why hasn't there been one on this one?
Well, I agree. It should be bipartisan, should have been bipartisan when Obamacare was passed. It should be now as well. For big things that affect the country, it should be done in a bipartisan way. But let's set the record straight. With this resistance movement to President Trump and the energy in the Democrat Party pulling Chuck Schumer as the leader far to the left, to the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren approach, Senator Schumer has been pretty clear up from the beginning that we should expect no cooperation from him. We know where Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren want to take it, which is to a single-payer, Canadian, British-style government-run program.
But has anybody reached out really in a serious way? Because we talked to Senator Manchin, number one on any list of reaching out to Democrats. He said he'd not heard from the Republicans or from the president. I mean, everybody in their opening gambit says no way, no how. Then you negotiate. That's kind of what the Senate does, isn't it?
Well, I visited on the floor of the Senate and off the floor with a number of Democrats, and they say, well, you know, we do want to work together, but there are a couple things. One is don't touch the mandate. Well, the mandate, the individual mandate that says people have to buy a government program, that's the most hated part of Obamacare. Oh, and they also say status quo is fine for Medicaid. But the status quo today is different than the original intent of Medicaid of protecting the most vulnerable in our society who are now getting crowded out of Medicaid because of the expansion. And they said, oh, and by the way, make sure you put more money in to stabilize insurance markets. Well, you know, President Trump just last week once again provided a transfusion to Obamacare, which is in the intensive care unit.
The you're a doctor,
yes.
And the AMA, the American Medical Association, does not like this Senate bill. Why don't your colleagues like it? Are they wrong?
Well, it's an interest. I'm still a member of the American Medical Association. They've done incredible things for patient safety and health care over the years. They were big supporters of the Obama health care law. They lost a lot of members as a result of that. I think that they're misguided on this because the doctors I talk to at home and the nurses and the patients, I was in Wyoming yesterday, continue to say we need to get rid of this Obamacare. We need to replace it with something that actually lowers the cost. It makes health care more affordable. Health is very, very personal, and we need to make sure that we do it right.
All right, Senator Barrasso, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be right back with our political panel. And we're back with our political panel. Amy Walter is the national editor of the Cook Political Report. Dan Balls is chief correspondent at the Washington Post. And we're also joined by Bloomberg View columnist Megan McArdle. And we're also joined by Slate's chief political correspondent and CBS News political analyst Jamelle Bouie. Dan, I want to start with you. You heard Senator Barrasso. It sounds like a bit of a free-for-all. Senator Collins was a little confused about what's coming. What's coming on health care?
I think the one thing that Senator Collins and Senator Barrasso agreed on in those two interviews was that nobody quite knows what's coming. They're prepared for anything. The first question is, can Senator McConnell get enough votes to get the bill onto the floor? I think that's still in question. And I think that he has decided that the only way you answer that question is to take the vote. It may be embarrassing for him in the end if he can't do it, but I think he wants in one way or another either to have this debate or to get some closure to where this particular chapter ends. And then we'll see what happens after that.
Megan, how do you see the nature of the thing that they're debating? I mean, it's a Republican-only conversation at the moment. What's happening?
There is no bipartisan consensus on what to do, and in fact, there's no partisan consensus on what to do. Listening to Republicans talk about what they're going to do with this bill is a little bit like listening to George R.R. Martin talk about what he's going to do when the next Game of Thrones novel is going to be published. You're like, you guys, just admit you're never going to finish it, and just let us grieve, right? And I think that we've been following this for months. Now, we saw a similar process with Obamacare, right? It was dead, it was alive, it was like the unzombie bill of the century. But the difference is that Democrats knew what they wanted to do with health care, right? I mean, they have lots of, obviously, within the caucus disagreement about exactly what to do. They wanted the government to provide a universal guarantee of coverage. Everyone in the caucus, to a first approximation, wanted that goal.
The Democrats did.
The Democrats did. The Republicans, what they would like is for Obamacare not to have passed. Unfortunately, since they don't have a time machine, and as far as I know have not funded research into it, although perhaps they should, there's not really any way to achieve what the actual caucus agrees on. Part of the caucus wants, to cut Medicaid. Part of the caucus really wants to pass something called the Obamacare Repeal Act of 2017, which gets rid of the tanning tax. And part of the caucus really just wants to slash this, completely get rid of it, and put nothing in its place. And there's no way to sort of pull all of those goals together.
Jamelle, Anthony Scaramucci said the president was the best legislative person in the world, I think he said. But the president has had a lot of different messages on here, and his approach, Susan Collins said she hadn't heard from him. Right. What do you make of his role in this process?
I mean, the striking thing is that the president hasn't had much of a role at all, other than simply repeating the rhetoric of the campaign, we're going to repeal and replace Obamacare. It's very difficult to see the extent to which he or his staff have really been engaged in this effort. And I think that is also a critical difference with what happened with the Affordable Care Act, where at the critical moments, right, after the election of Scott Brown, for example, Barack Obama, the White House, worked with congressional leaders to ensure that the bill would survive and make its way through. And Trump isn't involved. Trump hasn't, the president has not even been able to articulate exactly what his policy goals are. He has not really defended the theory of the case here. So he's largely hands off. And I think had the reverse been true, that might have been some of what you needed to get Republicans together, just like some straight up leadership. But in the absence of that, these divisions, these differences, they take the fore.
Give us a sense of the politics here. If Republicans don't pass something that repeals Obamacare, is that more painful than passing something that's not very popular at the moment based on all the polls?
I think for a lot of Republicans, it's like asking the question of, do you want to chew glass or poke a needle in your eye? Which one is less painful to do? Nobody likes this bill. Voters don't like it. Megan's right. People within the caucus don't like it, within the Republican caucus don't like it. Nobody really wants to vote on something, but they promised that they would vote for something. And then the most important thing then, if you're going to vote for something that nobody likes and you don't even particularly like very well as a member of Congress, how do you go out and defend it in the next election? And that's the real challenge here too. So there seems to be a piece where it's like a check the box for a lot of Republicans. We promised we'd do this. That's our number one concern. If we don't do it, our base is going to be upset and they're not going to turn out and vote for us. But if we check this box, get something done, we're just going to move on to things we like talking about and we'll be more coordinated on, like tax reform. The problem is that vote doesn't go away. Right. I talked to a number of Democratic strategists. They can't wait for 2018 to make the vote that Republicans have already taken on the House bill a central argument in 2018. Regardless of where they get on taxes, they still have to defend what they have or haven't done on health care.
And it's not just the substance of the bill there. It's very easy to say, if you're a Democratic strategist, that, listen, the Republican Party spent the better part of an entire first year, doing nothing. And that's hard to push back against.
I think there's also the thing of, it's actually better for them if it doesn't pass, right? It's better for each individual person if they voted to repeal Obamacare and then nothing happens. Because, yeah, you can go out and campaign, as Amy says, but the fact is most voters have no idea what this bill is. But the minute there's something that's actually happening, Republicans 100% own what's going to happen, and since a lot of people won't like what happens, they're in a rough spot.
Dan, I want to switch to the changes at the White House this week. Give me your sense of within this administration, but then also historically, presidents have often said, if I just fix the communications piece, everything's going to be great. Is that what this is, or is there something else?
Well, you have a White House that from the beginning was built to be dysfunctional. This is not a hierarchical administration. I mean, I've said this before. If you drew a table of organization of the White House, you would have all of these boxes, but they wouldn't necessarily connect with anything, or many would connect only directly with the president, or none would connect directly with the president. He likes it that way. So, yes, they have a communications problem, but it's so easy for every administration, and we've heard it before, to say, if only people understood what we were doing, then things would be fine. It's much more complicated than that, and the president gets in the way of that. The agenda gets in the way of that. What we've been talking about on health care clouds all of that, and obviously Russia gets in the way of that. So moving Anthony Scaramucci, who's certainly a different personality than Sean Spicer, into that role and have a visible role, could make some small difference, but the problem is so much bigger.
And Amy, one of the challenges is that the president's interviews and tweets seem to get in the way of his own agenda. That doesn't seem like it's changing based on Mr. Scaramucci.
That's right. That we've known from the very beginning that the real communications director in the White House is the President of the United States. And what he tweets sets the agenda. And so what you saw the day after Scaramucci was installed, we saw a whole line of tweets on Saturday from the president that were kind of all over the place, right? Whether it was the issue of pardons, there was a little bit about what he was doing down in Norfolk with commissioning a new ship, but really there was nothing there that was like a cohesive strategic message. This was Made in America week. That's what this week was started off to be. Certainly didn't end the week talking about the agenda. And that, you listen to Scaramucci talking to you, and he talked about we're going to get back to the agenda, we're going to get back to the agenda. The biggest difficulty in getting back to the agenda is the president's Twitter account, which they seem to have and this new White House communications director said, we just need to let him do more of it.
That's right, Megan. I mean, they've said, more from the president. Is that the solution?
It would not be my personal strategy were I appointed the czar of White House communications. I've often wondered why the White House doesn't have an aide who's just assigned to, every time the president gets a new cell phone, accidentally trip and break it. But, the fact is that's part of the problem. He hasn't really staffed up his administration. He doesn't have a policy agenda in a kind of traditional sense, right? He doesn't, when you see the lack of leadership on healthcare, he doesn't know what he wants on healthcare. He just wants it to be awesome. He wants people to like him. And that's sort of repeated over and over again, even on issues where, like immigration, yes, staffing up and doing some of these executive orders, but then beyond that, there's no kind of vision that you're going to be putting into place day by day, working with it, controlling the executive branch and making it do things. He doesn't have that. And so he focuses on controlling the news cycle and never thinks about, like, okay, you controlled this news cycle, but when you control news cycles with things that are bad for you, eventually that adds up into not getting an agenda done.
One of the things, Jamel, that was in the news cycle this week is this New York Times interview and the president's clear view that the investigators working for Robert Mueller and the special counsel himself, Robert Mueller, are somehow compromised. That seems to have been that, plus some of the things his other aides were saying, a new strategy from the White House.
Right. I think in keeping with Meghan's observation that the president wants to control the news cycle, and that's sort of where his skill set really lies, I think he's trying to wrestle control of the news cycle away from this investigation. And by making these allegations that the investigators are themselves personally compromised, I think his hope is to kind of sow doubt broadly among his supporters, and also sort of make this the crux of discussion and not the actual substantive investigation itself. I want to add on to what Meghan said and just emphasize that, you know, during the campaign, one of the President Trump's gifts, I guess, political gifts, was that he was everything to everyone. You could listen to a speech, you could watch him and sort of read in what you want to think. That is a disadvantage now that he's governing.
All right, we're going to have to end it there, and we'll be right back with some thoughts on Senator John McCain. When the news broke that John McCain had been diagnosed with brain cancer, the outpouring of well wishes all hailed his toughness. This week marks the anniversary of one such example. 50 years ago, the USS Forrestal aircraft carrier was deployed in the Gulf of Tonkin during the Vietnam War. A rocket accidentally fired, sparking a fire on the deck. It spread to planes preparing to launch and set off a chain reaction of explosions. 134 sailors were killed. One of the pilots preparing for takeoff who was hit was Senator John McCain, who miraculously escaped his burning A-4 Skyhawk. The math of durability in McCain's life is extraordinary. In addition to surviving the Forrestal, McCain has survived 3 other plane disasters, including being shot down over enemy territory. He then survived 5.5 years of torture as a prisoner of war and later 3 skin cancer surgeries. His former chief of staff and co-author, Mark Salter, wrote this: "John McCain will be around for a long while. I've always known he'd outlive me. I wrote the eulogy he'll give at my funeral. It's very touching." There is a basic idea to this fighting spirit, that there are standards worth devoting yourself to that are more important than your self-interest. That you should keep the faith, even if it means turning down early release from torture and living in a dark box in North Vietnam. He didn't just hold fast in Hanoi, wrote the New York Times' Jonathan Martin. An 80-year-old man with brain cancer pushed himself to exhaustion this year, traveling to reassure the world about America. This does not make John McCain a saint. He's flawed, a hothead, and has fallen short of his own standard. He'll tell you nearly all of this himself. But when off the path, his fight is to get back on it, to return to his standard. It's a human lesson for all of us who are tempted to recline into self-preservation. It's a call not just to admire the fight from a distance, but to fight a little harder ourselves. Back in a moment. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.